Hi, I'm Michelle Johnson. I am a second year in History and African American Studies. So my research looked at the Civil Rights Movement. Generally, it looks at civil rights movements in places outside of the South. So I start with the Great Migration, starting around 1916 when Black folks were moving from the South up to northern industrial cities. And from there, I look at how those same Black folks in cities took their Southern roots, took what was happening in the South, and made the Civil Rights Movement their own. So as Black Southerners moved into Chicago specifically, they set about rebuilding and creating new institutions. These included churches and schools, as well as branches of organizations like the NAACP and Congress of Racial Equality. Early on in the Civil Rights era, many of these groups were strategically made interracial, which is how I found myself, kind of unexpectedly, looking at the papers of Faith Rich, a white woman who worked as an unpaid staffer for the Chicago NAACP beginning in 1945 and working all the way until she passed away in the 1990s. In her more than 50 years living in a Black neighborhood on the west side of Chicago, she involved herself in nearly every education-related battle for equality, as well as political struggles over urban renewal policies. Though much of her work was working on creating research for reports, she was also not afraid of door-to-door organizing, doing a lot of block work, or block-based organizing work. Chicago civil rights movements were in some ways very similar to movements in the South. Much of the organizing started with desegregating restaurants and roller rinks, but then went on to schools, and eventually housing, and then eventually a lot of Black power-ish movements working on Black business. These individual movements, sort of broken down issue by issue, were also happening all at once throughout time and ended up being continued over the period starting around 1916 to 1970. So while you can break them down issue by issue, they also were concurrent throughout. In one of the most dramatic moments in 1963, 200,000 public school students stayed home from school to protest inequality in public education. 3 years later, before the schools came to a resolution, Martin Luther King moved into the city to fight for open housing. Local people on the ground juggled these shifting priorities as focus changed over time. The majority of my sources up to this point, doing research for a couple years, were not personal in nature. So I looked at a lot of reports created by community organizations, internal memos, drafts of speeches, things like that. But this was one of the first archives that I came across that had letters back and forth to husband and wife, for example. And I had to figure out what to make of that. It's a different type of source. I never had come across it. What do you do? And I found that actually it was really helpful in piecing together what the role of a white woman in a Black activist position meant, and how she felt about it, and how she took it on, and how her neighbors felt about it, and how her family felt about it. So it really shifted my focus on my research into not only Black folks organizing about issues that affected them, but also the ways that coalition was working in the city of Chicago in this period. Thank you.